Right, so we all know the story of Chris Benoit. It's one of the most infamous stories in all of wrestling history, and the consequences and fallout from it will be felt in wrestling forever, as two Benoit children remain, one of those being the son of Chris Benoit, David Benoit, who is someone who has kept a somewhat affiliation with wrestling since the passing of Chris Benoit, as he's shown his face at WWE and AEW events both in the front row and backstage with other wrestlers. He's even been banned from attending WWE shows until he was then unbanned, and from what I found out after talking about that banning in a recent video is that David Benoit was actually set to make his wrestling debut at some point, but it completely fell through. And this is something I never knew, so I had to learn about this. I immediately googled David Benoit wrestling debut, which brought me up to his David Benoit Pro Wrestling Wikipedia fandom page, where it said he was set to make his pro wrestling debut at WCW Revival on June 4th, 2014, so I immediately assumed this must have been the show that he was meant to be on. So I found the wiki for that, and I was very confused to see names like Drew McIntyre, MVP, Shawn Michaels and Sting on this, until I realized that I was on the Wikipedia for what appears to be an eFed or a universe mode save, as apparently on this show in June 2014, David Benoit teamed up with his father Chris Benoit and Ned Edgewalker to defeat the Usos and Justin Gabriel. Now I'm sure this was the match of the century, but unfortunately it's not real and didn't actually happen. Hey, 16k in attendance though? More than AEW, am I right? But upon a little further inspection, and by that I mean the very next Google result down, it turns out this story was indeed true, and David Benoit did indeed have a real-life wrestling debut match that fell through, and it led me down a rabbit hole wherein I discovered a short-lived Canadian wrestling promotion that scammed wrestlers, fans, and like I said, was even meant to have a David Benoit match that fell through and was cancelled under strange circumstances. So today I'm here to tell the full story and talk about the wrestling debut that fell through of David Benoit, the son of Chris Benoit, and talk about the rise and fall of Hart Legacy Wrestling. So Hart Legacy Wrestling is a Canadian professional wrestling promotion that was founded in 2013, and right off the bat, you can probably guess that this is affiliated with the Hart family, and you would be correct, as it was founded by none other than Teddy Hart. If you don't know, Teddy Hart is the degenerate outcast of the Hart family who has found himself in many controversies and is one of the most infamous independent wrestlers of all time. He helped found this promotion alongside his other associates, including Smith Hart, who was the brother of Bret Hart, John Oniston, who served as the owner upon founding, and his partner Stacey Angel, who is the current owner today. And in case you're wondering, the hitman himself, Bret Hart, has had zero involvement in the history of Hart Legacy Wrestling. And so the promotion would hold their first event on the 18th of January 2013 called Resurrection, as the event got a great turnout with up to 1,800 fans in attendance, featuring names like Bobby Lashley, Lance Archer, Chris Masters, Teddy Hart, Trent Beretta, Jack Evans, Davey Boy Smith Jr., Brian Cage, Kalisto, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, and it even featured the final Canadian independent appearance of one El Generico before he of course signed, unfortunately passed away. And so just looking on paper at this card and all the names they got on it and the attendance that they got, it looks like this show was a huge success, and whilst it may have been for the Hart family and the owners of the promotion that got paid, it wasn't for the wrestlers and other talent on the show that didn't get paid. Yep, that's right, in the least surprising news of all time, a promotion being ran by Teddy Hart didn't pay its wrestlers. Yes, shocking, I know. As apparently it was during intermission for the show where staff got bad news that they weren't going to be paid at the end of the night, as they were told that they would be paid from the show a few weeks later, but a few weeks would go by and most of the talent on the show had claimed that they still hadn't been paid. And not only had wrestlers also been burned, but organizers had also been burned, as an online pay-per-view was promised for the event that was never aired or put into production, and also a hotel manager claims that he was out $3,200 in pocket for unpaid hotel rooms. Teddy Hart released a response immediately trying to downplay it and pass the blame onto others, saying that others were managing the money and he was just lending the family name. And he said he wants to make it up to fans and staff at the next show that was planned for later that month, that being February 2013, but it would never take place. And instead of addressing the payment issues, the Hart Legacy Wrestling promoters would instead run away, and they would start a new promotion in another name called AAA Canada Next Generation Wrestling, and they would run a show in February on February 22nd, which was the date that the Hart Legacy Wrestling show was meant to be taking place, but now they're just doing it with a completely different name. It had all the same management, it was at the same venue, and featured many of the same wrestlers from the first show, but sure enough, this would be the only show under this name, as they would quickly go back to the Hart Legacy Wrestling name, and apparently it wasn't until 2015 when the payment issues were finally sorted. So yeah, not a great start to life for Hart Legacy Wrestling. They run their first show, it does a good house, but unfortunately no one gets paid. It gets the major backlash from within the industry to the point they rename and try to hide away and run another show, but then quickly come back to their senses and try to go back to the old name, but now they have a tarnished reputation because of that first show. So what's the next best move to try get some buzz back into Hart Legacy Wrestling and try get some word going around and get some fans back in the building after losing the trust? Well, only by getting in the son of the most controversial wrestler in history. Of course, it is now time to talk about the failed wrestling debut of David Benoit. As in April of 2014, it was announced by Smith Hart that David Benoit would be making his in-ring debut for Hart Legacy Wrestling at their July 18th event in a tag team match where he would be teaming with none other than Chavo Guerrero, who was a close friend of Chris Benoit. It was an out-of-nowhere move and an out-of-nowhere announcement for David Benoit to be making his wrestling debut, as it didn't seem there was any word on him that he had been training or was in training for any period of time. However, Smith Hart claims that Benoit had been training with David Hart Smith, and if there was any situation for David Benoit to make his wrestling debut, I guess it would be in his home country teaming up with Chavo Guerrero. It would be more than appropriate, I guess, and I guess if he's training, then that makes it okay, but unfortunately, Smith Hart was completely lying, and David Benoit was not in training. As another close friend of Chris Benoit would be informed of this match taking place and was not happy about it, that is Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho would inform Chavo Guerrero that no, David Benoit did not have any formal wrestling training, which led to Chavo Guerrero pulling out of the match himself, and the match would of course be pulled entirely. In fact, the entire show was cancelled as a result of this match getting cancelled. I guess this was the marquee match of the event. It seems as though Smith Hart had given two different versions to Chavo Guerrero and Chris Jericho. He told Chavo that David had been fully trained and was ready to make the debut match, whereas he told Chris Jericho that David was only going to be part of a storyline and only doing an angle on the show. But yeah, this was a complete lie. David Benoit was not in training, Chris Jericho knew it, and the training that David Benoit had done in wrestling up until this point consisted of him enrolling at Lance Storm's school at one point and then failing to show up on the first day. Somehow Smith Hart saw this and said, yes, let's get you in the main event of our big show. Chris Jericho's intervention led to both David Benoit and Chavo Guerrero cancelling the match, and it was definitely for the better, and Chris Jericho was doing the right thing here. And since then, David Benoit hasn't seemed to make any effort to make a proper in-ring debut or a start in the wrestling business, and by this point it's probably too late. On the 29th of August 2021, David Benoit would turn up at a real Canadian wrestling show where he announced he was part of the roster and the newest edition, and also said that he wanted to have at least one match whilst he was there. But surprise, surprise, nothing ever happens. And as for Hart Legacy Wrestling, they would occasionally do events for the next few years, with their last one seemingly taking place just before the pandemic in February of 2020. But yeah, that is the story of Hart Legacy Wrestling, Teddy Hart's sham wrestling company, and the time they tried to book Chris Benoit's son, David Benoit, in his debut wrestling match, despite having zero training in wrestling whatsoever. That'll do it for this video. Like it if you enjoyed. I'll see you all in the next one. Subscribe for more. Goodbye, and keep on rolling.